The night of the gala was like a dream for many. The lights were shining so bright that the whole street outside the Grand Hotel seemed like a stage. Reporters lined the red carpet, their cameras flashing again and again, each flash capturing a smile, a dress, or a famous face. People shouted names of stars, hoping to get a glance or a wave. It was a world of glamour where everyone tried to shine brighter than the other. Inside the ballroom, golden chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their crystals reflecting like stars in the night sky. The tables were dressed in white silk and silver cutlery, glasses ready for champagne, and music played softly in the background. Among the shining stars came a man who did not walk with a loud noise or demand for attention. It was Keanu Reeves. He stepped out of his car without bodyguards surrounding him. His suit was simple, black, not too expensive looking, but neat and clean. He walked the carpet calmly, nodding to the fans who screamed his name. Some reporters rushed to him asking for pictures and short comments. But unlike other actors who posed long, Keanu only smiled, waved, and moved inside. He did not stay long for the cameras. Inside, the atmosphere was different from outside. While fans loved him, many of the guests inside were not as welcoming. They were people dressed in glittering clothes, women with diamond necklaces that caught the light, men wearing tailored suits that cost more than a car. They looked at Keanu with eyes that judged. Quietly, they whispered to each other behind fake smiles. One lady with a jeweled mask leaned to another and said, "Why does he look so plain? He could at least try to look like a star." Another man laughed softly and replied, "He is rich but still dresses like a man who came from the subway." Their words carried a sharp edge. Keanu heard some of the whispers but pretended not to. He had lived long enough in Hollywood to know how shallow some events could be. He walked with calm steps, greeting people politely. His nature was always gentle. He shook hands and thanked the hosts. But inside, he felt a quiet sting. He had been invited to support the charity cause, not to compete in a fashion show, yet people seemed to care more about his suit than the purpose of the night. At one corner of the hall, a group of young actors watched him pass by. One of them smirked. "He looks like he borrowed his clothes." They laughed under their breath. Keanu, catching the tone, only gave a polite nod and kept moving. He did not fight back. He never did. His silence was stronger than their shallow jokes. Still, the feeling of being the odd one out hung heavy in the air. The gala was supposed to be about kindness, about raising money for children who needed help. Yet here people were, spending more energy judging a man who chose simplicity over display. As Keanu found his seat at one of the tables near the stage, the hall continued to buzz with laughter, whispers, and loud conversations about fashion and wealth. The waiters moved between tables serving sparkling drinks, but a few eyes always followed Keanu, not with admiration, but with quiet judgment. He sat down, his posture calm, his face unreadable. But inside he felt the sharp truth. Fame does not always protect a man from insult. Sometimes it makes him more of a target. He tried to remind himself why he came, not for the applause, not for the spotlight, but for the cause of the children the gala supported. Yet still, the sting of those whispers clung to him like shadows. The evening was young. The speeches had not yet started, and already Keanu was painted as the simple one, a man too modest for the shining hall. His heart told him to stay quiet, to focus on the bigger purpose. But there was no denying the small ache inside. He knew this night was going to test him in ways he did not expect, and the story of that night was only beginning. The music inside the hall played softly, but behind the soft music there was another sound, the quiet hum of whispers that spread from table to table like smoke. Keanu walked slowly toward his seat, and though he did not look around much, he could feel the eyes on him. Not the warm and welcoming kind of eyes, but the judging kind. Eyes that measured every detail of his suit, his shoes, even the way he carried himself. At one corner of the hall, two men leaned toward each other, their champagne glasses tilted in their hands. One said with a mocking smile, "He really came dressed like that. Doesn't he know this is a gala, not a funeral?" The other man laughed and answered, "That's Keanu for you. He has money but acts like a monk." Their words were not meant for Keanu to hear, but sound carries in a hall when it is sharpened with insult. Keanu's ears caught enough to understand. Still, he kept his head down. He gave no sign of anger. At another table, a group of young women watched him pass. One of them whispered, "He doesn't even try to impress, he's always so plain, maybe he thinks humility is fashionable." Her friend giggled behind her hand. Imagine having millions and still showing up looking so ordinary. The laughter was soft, hidden behind painted smiles, but Keanu felt it all the same. He took his seat quietly, pulling the chair without making a sound. The tablecloth was white, the glasses shining under the chandeliers. But for him, the seat felt heavier than stone. The hall was decorated for beauty, but inside it was filled with judgment. People who wore kindness on their faces but cruelty on their tongues. He could hear more whispers floating across the room, even from people who pretended to be focused on their food. Why does he even come to these things? One guest muttered to his partner. He doesn't belong with this crowd. Look at him, so dull, so plain. He doesn't fit the shine. Another voice answered. Maybe he wants attention, but honestly, he looks like he stumbled in from the street. The words stung, though Keanu acted like he didn't hear. His nature was always calm. He had faced bigger storms in his life than whispers at a table. He had lost family. He had faced grief that could crush a man. What were a few shallow insults compared to that? And yet in this glittering hall, filled with fake smiles and expensive perfume, those small words cut deeper than they should, because they were spoken not by strangers in the street, but by people who called themselves part of the same world. A waiter passed by and smiled at him gently, offering him water. Keanu gave a small nod and a grateful thank you. His kindness was simple but real, unlike the fake charm many wore tonight. Still, as he lifted the glass, he caught a reflection in the crystal. Behind him, a man at another table was pointing at him while whispering to his group. Their eyes all turned and then quickly looked away when Keanu's head shifted. He sighed softly, taking a sip of water to hide his discomfort. Around him, the gala continued as if nothing was wrong. Laughter rose from different tables, clinking glasses filled the room. But for Keanu, every sound carried another layer of judgment. He sat still, silent, almost invisible, and yet the whispers made him feel more exposed than if he were standing on the stage. He thought about leaving, walking out of the hall, but he reminded himself of why he had come. This was a charity for children, and if he walked out now, the insult would win. He breathed deeply, straightened in his chair, and told himself to endure. He had always believed in staying humble, in not letting fame turn him into someone he wasn't. But nights like this made that choice heavier. People around him were too busy comparing diamonds and suits to notice the weight of real character. Whispers did not stop. They traveled like shadows across the hall. Some people spoke softly, but their eyes shouted louder than their mouths. Keanu knew that no matter how silent he stayed, no matter how kind he acted, there would always be people who found fault in simplicity. Still, he chose silence. He chose dignity, even as the crowd's judgment wrapped around him like a cold wind. In his heart, he wondered how long this night would go on, how many more whispers he would have to carry before the evening ended. He could not know that someone else would soon walk in, someone whose presence would shift the entire air of the gala. But for now, in this moment, Keanu sat surrounded by whispers, enduring them with quiet strength, holding on to the belief that kindness mattered more than appearance, even if no one in that room seemed to see it yet. The evening moved forward slowly. The sound of forks and knives against glass plates echoed in the grand hall. The chandeliers sparkled above like frozen rain, but under the glow of lights there was a weight in the air. The whispers had already left their mark, and Keanu sat at his table in silence, his calm face hiding the small ache inside. At first it seemed like the rude comments would stay in whispers, quiet enough to ignore, but some people at the gala were not content with being subtle. One man at the table across from Keanu had been drinking too much wine. His laughter grew louder with each glass, and with it, his tongue became sharper. His friends tried to quiet him, but he waved them off, his eyes fixed on Keanu with a smirk that carried no kindness. He leaned back in his chair and said in a voice that reached farther than it should, "Look at him, the great movie star, and yet he dresses like a poor teacher." His words floated through the hall. Soft music could not cover them. A few people looked down at their plates. Others hid a smile behind their hands, but no one spoke against him. Keanu heard it clearly. He did not lift his eyes. Instead, he took a small sip of water, trying to let it pass like all the other whispers. But the man was not finished. Maybe he thinks sadness is fashionable, or maybe he just wants everyone to feel sorry for him. He chuckled at his own cruelty, his laughter sharp as a knife. The insult spread quickly. It was not shouted, but it was loud enough for nearby tables to catch it, and soon the air was filled with quiet reactions. Some people laughed softly, some shook their heads, and a few looked at Keanu with pity. But pity was not what he wanted. Pity was another form of judgment. Keanu placed his glass down gently, his fingers calm, his face still unreadable. He could have responded. He could have spoken words that cut sharper than the insult. But that was not his way. He had lived long enough to know that silence often spoke louder. Still, silence was not easy. It felt like swallowing fire and pretending it was water. The man across the table leaned forward again, his voice mocking. "Tell me, Keanu, do you save your money for something? Or do you just enjoy looking invisible at grand events?" His friends laughed with him this time, and the laughter spread like a stain through the tables around. Keanu looked up at him finally, his eyes calm but steady. There was no anger, no fire, only the quiet weight of a man who refused to break. For a moment the hall grew silent. The insult hung heavy in the air. People waited, maybe expecting Keanu to fight back, maybe hoping he would rise in anger. But he did not. He only lowered, his eyes again, his silence like a wall between him and the cruelty, his dignity intact but the sting of the insult still sharp in the room. Some guests shifted uncomfortably. A woman at another table whispered to her friend, "That was too much." But she did not say it aloud. No one stopped the man. No one defended Keanu. They all allowed the insult to rest in the Golden Hall as if it was just another part of the evening. Inside, Keanu reminded himself again why he was there. Not for them, not for their approval, but for the cause the gala was supporting. He thought of the children who would benefit from the donations, children who needed food, education, and safety. He told himself their needs were greater than his hurt. But even with that thought, his heart carried the weight of being mocked so openly. The waiters moved quietly between the tables, serving dishes, pouring drinks, trying to keep the night smooth, but even they could feel the heaviness in the air. One young waiter looked at Keanu with quiet sympathy as he placed a plate in front of him. Keanu gave a small nod, a simple thank you, his kindness still shining even in that moment of insult. But the truth was clear. Keanu had been humiliated in front of his peers, not by accident, but by a man who chose cruelty for entertainment. And the room had let it happen. The insult was like a scar on the evening, a mark that could not be erased, at least not by silence alone. What Keanu did not know, what none of them expected, was that the night was not finished. Another man was about to walk into that golden hall, a man whose presence could change the air itself, someone who would not let the insult stand without an answer. But in this moment, before that entrance, the insult lingered, and Keanu bore it with quiet strength, his silence more powerful than words, even as the room around him failed to show the kindness the gala was meant to represent. The hall was heavy with silence after the insult. The air felt tense, the laughter had faded and only soft clinking of forks could be heard. Keanu sat still, calm on the outside, but the weight of the cruel words hung over him like a shadow. People kept glancing at him, some curious, some uncomfortable, but no one had spoken up. It was as if the insult was now part of the evening, unchallenged and accepted. Then, without warning, the tall doors of the gala opened once more. The sound of them moving caught the attention of the room, and in walked Richard Gere. His presence was like a shift in the air. He carried himself with grace. His steps were confident but not arrogant, and his smile lit up the room in a way the chandeliers could not. People turned their heads quickly. Whispers of a new kind spread. "It's Richard Gere. He's here." He wore a classic black suit, simple yet elegant. His silver hair caught the light, and his calm energy seemed to pour across the hall like warm sunlight. Richard greeted the hosts with a gentle handshake, his charm quiet but powerful. He did not rush. He moved slowly, his eyes scanning the room as if he could sense the mood had been broken moments earlier. People who had moments ago been smirking or whispering now straightened in their chairs, adjusting their faces into smiles, trying to look respectable in the presence of another great star. The man who had made the insult earlier cleared his throat and sat back, his laughter gone. He fiddled with his wine glass, trying to act as if nothing had happened. Richard Gere walked further in, waving softly at a few familiar faces, and then his eyes landed on Keanu. He paused, and a warm, genuine smile spread across his face. Without hesitation, he walked directly toward him. The crowd followed his movement, and soon all eyes were once again on Keanu. But this time, not with judgment, this time with curiosity. Keanu looked up, surprised, his face still calm but his eyes showing a flicker of relief. Richard stretched out his hand before even reaching the table. "Keanu," he said warmly, his voice carrying across the hall. "It's so good to see you." The room stirred and suddenly the energy shifted. Richard leaned down and embraced Keanu like an old friend, the kind of hug that carried respect, not just politeness. The hall that had been filled with whispers was now filled with silence again. But this silence was different. It was not cruel, it was expectant. People watched as Richard Gere stood beside Keanu, still keeping a hand on his shoulder, as if to show the world where his loyalty stood. The man who had insulted Keanu earlier shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding the sight. Richard straightened and looked around, his smile never fading. "I'm late, but I'm glad I didn't miss this," he said. And laughter bubbled lightly across the room. Genuine this time. He gave a small nod to the crowd and then sat down near Keanu, keeping the mood warm. It was as if his entrance had washed away some of the bitterness, like a fresh breeze entering a room full of stale air. But more than his words, it was the way he carried himself that changed things. Richard Gere was not only respected for his acting, but also for his compassion and humanity. People admired him, and when he showed warmth toward Keanu, it forced everyone else to look at Keanu in a new light. The whispers that had mocked him now seemed shallow. The cruel laughter seemed out of place. Keanu gave a small smile, soft and thankful. Though he did not speak much, his silence was still there. But this time it was not lonely. Richard's presence beside him was like a shield, and the crowd could feel it. The man who had spoken the insult tried to join in the polite laughter that followed Richard's arrival, but his face burned red. He no longer looked confident. The gala continued, the music still soft, the waiters still moving, but the mood was no longer poisoned. Richard Gere had brought with him a different kind of light, one built on respect, and everyone in the hall could feel it. People who had judged Keanu minutes earlier now avoided each other's eyes, ashamed of their whispers. Their cruelty now looked small and cowardly compared to Richard's open show of friendship. For Keanu, it was like a quiet rescue. He had not asked for it. He had not even wanted attention. But Richard's entrance had lifted the heavy air, giving him a moment to breathe again. And as he sat with Richard at the table, he realized that sometimes kindness arrives without being called, and when it does, it has the power to change everything. The insult that had burned the hall moments ago was fading, covered by the brightness of a simple hug, a smile, and a warm voice that reminded everyone what true respect looked like. The gala, which had seemed cruel and shallow, was slowly being reset. And though Keanu stayed as humble and quiet as ever, the crowd's eyes on him had shifted, no longer filled with judgment, but with something closer to admiration. And it all began with Richard Gere's entrance. The mood inside the gala hall had already begun to change after Richard Gere's warm entrance. His hug to Keanu had spoken louder than any words. People, who had been whispering cruel things earlier, now sat quiet, some shifting nervously in their seats, others trying to pretend they had not said a word. Keanu stayed calm, his quiet smile showing gratitude, but he still sat with the same modest posture, not seeking more attention. Then, a moment came when the host invited Richard Gere to say a few words. He was one of the honored guests of the night, and the crowd applauded loudly as he stood. Richard moved toward the stage with his graceful walk. His presence filled the room with ease. He stood before the microphone, his smile soft, his eyes kind. The hall grew silent, waiting for him to speak. "Thank you," Richard began, his voice steady but gentle. "It is always a joy to be here, to support such a wonderful cause." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But tonight, before I say anything about the charity, I want to say something about a man who is here with us, someone I have admired for years, not just for his talent, but for his heart." His eyes shifted across the room, landing directly on Keanu. People turned too, following his gaze. Suddenly every face was looking at Keanu. The silence deepened. Richard smiled wider. "Keanu Reeves," he said clearly. The name carried warmth. "Is one of the kindest souls I have ever known." Whispers rippled through the crowd. But these whispers were not mocking. They were filled with surprise, Richard continued. "Many of you see him on screen in great roles in action and drama, but what you don't always see are the quiet moments when no camera is rolling. You don't see him give up his seat on a crowded train, or stop to sign autographs for children long after everyone else has walked away. You don't see him quietly donate millions to hospitals without wanting his name attached. But I have heard these stories, and I know them too. Be true." The audience leaned in now. Even those who had laughed earlier sat frozen, their eyes fixed on the stage. Richard's words cut deeper than any insult. But this time they cut with kindness, reminding people of who Keanu truly was. "He does not wear diamonds to shine," Richard said, his voice stronger. "He shines because he treats everyone with dignity, because he carries himself with humility, because he believes being human is more important than being a star." Applause began to rise, small at first, then louder, people clapping not out of politeness but out of genuine respect. Keanu sat still, his face calm, but inside his chest was a quiet storm of emotions. He had never wanted praise, never wanted attention for the things he did in private. Yet hearing another respected actor speak of him with such honor filled his heart with both gratitude and humility. He lowered his eyes slightly, as if trying to hide his feelings. The man who had insulted him earlier looked pale, his smirk gone, his wine glass untouched. He stared down at his plate, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The room that once echoed with his laughter now felt like a courtroom where judgment had turned back on him. Richard ended his words by saying, "We are here tonight to talk about kindness, to give hope to those who need it most. And when I think of kindness, I think of Keanu because he lives it every day, even when no one is watching." The applause thundered now. People stood, some clapping harder than before. The hall was filled with respect instead of whispers, light instead of shadows. Keanu gave a small nod from his table, his eyes shining slightly, though he tried to hide it. He never liked the spotlight. But tonight Richard had used it to shield him, to lift him up. And in that moment, Keanu understood that sometimes silence needs a voice beside it, a voice that speaks not for glory, but for truth. When Richard stepped down from the stage, he returned to sit beside Keanu, the applause still echoing through the hall. He leaned close and said softly, "They needed to hear it." Keanu whispered back, "Thank you." His voice quiet but filled with meaning. Richard only smiled, patting his shoulder gently. The people around them looked at Keanu differently now, no longer seeing a plain man in a simple suit, but seeing the dignity and kindness that had always been there. The same people who had mocked him now clapped for him, and in their applause was a quiet apology, an unspoken admission that they had been wrong. The gala was no longer just about wealth and glitter. It had become a lesson, a reminder that true greatness comes not from what one wears, but from how one treats others, and Richard Gere had been the one to bring that truth into the open. For Keanu, it was a moment he would never forget, not because of the applause, but because someone had chosen kindness over silence, and in doing so, had turned a night of insult into a night of respect, a night where humanity shone brighter than the chandeliers. The applause still echoed through the grand hall. It rolled, like a wave, starting strong and then settling into a steady rhythm. People who only moments ago had been silent or whispering cruel jokes now clapped until their hands turned red. The chandeliers above seemed to shine brighter, as if reflecting the shift in the atmosphere. Keanu remained seated, his posture calm, as ever, but his eyes showed a quiet gratitude. He had not asked for this defense, yet Richard's words had lifted the heavy shadow that had hung over him all evening. Around the tables, faces changed. The same men and women who had laughed earlier now tried to look serious and respectful. Some smiled too brightly. Others avoided Keanu's eyes altogether. They had judged him for his simplicity, but now they felt the sting of shame. Their whispers sounded foolish in their own memories. It was as if a mirror had been placed before them, showing how shallow they had looked. One young actor who had earlier smirked about Keanu's suit leaned to his friend and whispered nervously, "Maybe we were wrong. Maybe he's not like the others." His friend nodded quickly, as if agreeing would erase what they had said before. At another table, a woman who had mocked his plainness clapped extra loudly now, her diamond bracelet jingling with each clap. But the guilt in her eyes was clear. The man who had insulted Keanu the loudest earlier sat frozen in his chair, his face pale, his arrogance gone. He looked at his glass of wine as if it could hide him. His laughter had once filled the hall, but now the sound of his voice seemed small in his own memory. He dared not raise his eyes toward Keanu, afraid of what he might see there. Keanu, however, did not look at him. He did not look at anyone in anger or bitterness. Instead, he kept his gaze soft, his hands folded quietly in his lap. His silence was not heavy anymore. It was gentle, forgiving. He had no need to punish those who mocked him. Their shame was punishment enough. Richard Gere sat beside him, smiling warmly, his speech still lingering in the minds of everyone present. He had spoken of Keanu's kindness, his humility, and his hidden acts of generosity. The crowd could not forget it. The image of Keanu giving quietly without asking for recognition was now planted in their minds. The whispers that once mocked him now turned into different kinds of whispers. This time filled with admiration. "I heard he gave away most of his salary on that film," one guest said quietly. Another added, "My cousin once met him on the subway. He gave up his seat to an old lady. Imagine a star doing that." These stories, true and simple, began to spread quickly across the tables, and with each story, the respect for Keanu grew stronger. The waiters, who had earlier watched silently, now smiled as they moved past his table. They had always noticed how differently Keanu treated them compared to other stars. He thanked them, looked them in the eye, spoke to them as equals. Tonight, they saw the rest of the room finally noticing the man they had always known. For the guests, the shift was humbling. The gala had started with sparkling jewels, fancy gowns, and whispered judgments, but now it felt different. Now the room was filled with a sense of lesson learned. Richard's words had reminded them all that wealth and appearance meant nothing compared to kindness. They realized how blind they had been. Keanu stayed quiet through it all. When people looked at him now, he only offered a small nod or a gentle smile. He did not bask in the new admiration. He did not take revenge with pride. Instead, he carried himself with the same calm humility he had shown from the beginning. His silence spoke louder than any boast ever could. The man who had mocked him most could not take the silence anymore. He shifted uncomfortably, his hands shaking as he set his glass down. He muttered to his companions, "I went too far," but they did not answer. Their eyes were on the stage, avoiding him. His arrogance had made him the center earlier. Now it made him invisible. As the evening moved forward, the conversations at the tables changed. People began to talk about charity again, about the cause they had gathered for. It seemed as if Richard's speech had pulled everyone back to the true purpose of the night. Yet in every discussion, Keanu's name lingered, no longer as a target of mockery, but as an example of what humility looked like. Keanu sat quietly, grateful that the focus had shifted back to the children who needed help. He listened as the host announced new donations, clapping along with the rest, but deep inside he felt a quiet peace. Not because he had been defended, but because kindness had won over cruelty. The guests who had laughed at him earlier now looked at him differently. Their glances carried apology. Some even wanted to walk up and shake his hand, but his quiet presence kept them still. They knew words could not erase what they had said, but they hoped their changed hearts could at least honor him from afar. The gala sparkled on, but now the shine was no longer only from diamonds and lights. It came from the atmosphere itself, a warmth that replaced the cold whispers, a respect that replaced shallow laughter. Richard Gere's voice had started it. But Keanu's quiet dignity had sealed it. The crowd had learned, and they would not forget. By the end of the evening, everyone understood something simple but powerful. True greatness is not in loudness, it is in humility, and sometimes the strongest man in the room is the one who stays silent when others laugh. Keanu had shown them that without ever raising his voice. As the gala slowly moved toward its final hours, the music softened even more. The crowd relaxed after the long evening, and people began to move away from the tables. Some gathered in small groups near the bar, others walked outside to the terrace, where the cool night air touched their faces. The mood had shifted completely from earlier. What began as a night of whispers and insults had now become a night of respect and quiet admiration. Keanu remained at his table for a while, still calm, still quiet. His presence no longer mocked but now admired. People looked at him from across the room with softer eyes. Some even tried to approach, but he kept his movements simple, standing only when needed, thanking the waiters, and avoiding the spotlight as much as possible. He was never the kind to enjoy grand attention, and tonight was no different. Richard Gere, after speaking to a few guests, returned to Keanu's side. They sat together in a comfortable silence, like two men who understood each other without the need for many words. The lights around them glowed softer now. The hall no longer carried the sharpness it had earlier. Instead, it felt warmer, almost gentler. Finally, when the main speeches ended and the crowd began drifting toward the exits, Keanu stood up slowly. Richard followed him. Together, they walked toward a quieter corner of the hall, away from the bright chandeliers and the chatter of the remaining guests. It was there, near a tall window overlooking the city lights, that Keanu finally spoke in a low voice. "Thank you," he said simply, his tone soft, but carrying the weight of his heart. His eyes looked at Richard with quiet honesty. "You didn't have to do that." Richard smiled, his expression kind and calm. "I had to," he answered. "Because silence is good, Keanu, but sometimes people need to be reminded who you really are. They needed to hear the truth, not the lies whispered behind your back." His voice was steady, filled with sincerity. Keanu lowered his gaze for a moment. His shoulders relaxed as if the weight of the evening was slowly lifting away. "I don't like the attention," he admitted. "I never did. I try to live simply, and sometimes people think it means I don't belong." His words were soft, almost like a confession. Richard placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "But that is why you do belong. You remind them that being human is more important than shining the brightest. You don't have to say much. Your life speaks for you." Tonight they saw that, and maybe it will change the way they think. His eyes shone with quiet wisdom. For a moment the two men stood there looking out at the city through the tall window, the lights blinking like stars. Keanu felt a rare peace. He had spent so much of the night enduring silence, carrying the sting of judgment, but now that silence was filled with gratitude, with understanding, he realized that kindness can come in many forms. Sometimes it is staying quiet. Sometimes it is standing up for someone else, and tonight Richard had done the latter for him. Behind them, a few guests passed by, offering polite nods and smiles. One or two even stopped to shake Keanu's hand, their voices filled with awkward respect. "It was an honor to see you tonight," one said. Another added, "You are an inspiration." Their words carried the apology they could not say directly. Keanu responded with a small smile, a nod, and his usual quiet, not needing to say more. Richard chuckled softly once they left. "See, they learned something tonight," he said. Keanu's lips curved into a faint smile. "Maybe," he answered. "Or maybe they'll forget tomorrow, but at least for one night, they remembered kindness." The words hung between them, simple yet true. Richard gave a small nod. "Even if they forget, you'll keep living it, and that matters more." The night grew quieter as more guests left. The hall slowly emptied, and the sound of heels and polished shoes echoed faintly against the marble floor. Keanu and Richard walked together toward the exit, their pace unhurried. Side by side like brothers, the earlier sting of insult was gone, replaced by the warmth of respect and friendship. Outside, the cool night breeze brushed against them. The street was calmer now. Only a few fans remained behind the ropes. holding phones and calling names. When they saw Keanu and Richard together, they cheered, their voices excited. Keanu waved softly. Richard did the same. And the crowd's cheers carried no judgment, only joy. Before parting ways, Keanu turned to Richard one last time, his words still soft but filled with meaning. "Tonight would have been harder without you." Richard placed a hand over his heart and said, "That's what friends are for, Keanu. Kindness is louder than insult, always remember that." Keanu gave him a gentle smile, one of those rare smiles that carried more than words ever could. Then they parted, Richard heading toward his car, Keanu toward his own quiet path, but both carried with them the weight of the evening, not as pain, but as a reminder that even in a room filled with judgment, kindness has the power to change everything. The gala would be remembered for many things, the glitter, the music, the charity. But for those who had witnessed it, the strongest memory would not be the diamonds or the gowns. It would be the moment Richard Gere stood for Keanu Reeves, and the moment Keanu's silence turned into a symbol of strength. Their friendship that night became a story in itself, one that reminded everyone watching that dignity and kindness always outshine cruelty. The gala came to an end slowly. The music faded and the last glasses of champagne were collected by the waiters. The grand chandeliers still sparkled above, but their light now fell on a hall that felt very different from the one at the beginning. The cruel whispers and mocking laughter that had filled the air earlier were gone. What remained was a soft quiet, almost like a reflection. People spoke in lower tones, their faces calmer, their steps slower as they left the tables and made their way toward the doors. Keanu walked through the room without hurry. He nodded politely at those who looked at him. Some guests who had mocked him earlier now struggled to meet his eyes, their faces red with shame. A few brave ones smiled awkwardly, trying to cover the guilt with forced politeness. But Keanu's response was the same for everyone, a gentle nod, a kind half-smile. He carried no anger in his face, only peace. Tomier, man who had insulted him the loudest earlier, kept his distance. He stayed near the back, pretending to be busy with his phone, but the truth was clear on his face. He had been silenced not by Keanu's words, but by Richard Gere's courage and the applause of the crowd. His arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet regret. He would remember this night as the one where his laughter turned against him. Outside the hall, the night was cool. Cars lined up to pick up the guests. Photographers waited at the edges, snapping last pictures of gowns and jewels. But the biggest talk among those leaving was not about fashion or wealth. It was about what had happened inside. People whispered to each other. "Did you hear what Richard Gere said? I didn't know Keanu did so much for charity. He really is different from the rest." The story was already spreading, the lesson already planting itself in their minds. For many of the guests, the night became a mirror. They had come expecting to show off, to outshine others with their clothes and wealth. But instead they left thinking about humility. They remembered the way Keanu had stayed quiet even when mocked, the way he never lost his calm, and then the way Richard had lifted him with a few kind words. It was a moment that humbled them, a moment they could not ignore. Keanu himself did not celebrate the change. He did not walk out feeling like a hero. He simply continued to be himself. Quiet, modest, grateful. He waved at a few fans waiting outside, took time to sign autographs, and even stopped to listen when a young girl shouted that she loved his movies. He smiled gently and thanked her. His kindness showed in small actions, the kind most people ignored until nights like this forced them to see. Richard walked out shortly after, and as the two men said goodbye again, the warmth in their exchange showed more than any speech could. Richard had reminded the world that night of something simple, and Keanu had proven it true. With the way he carried himself, together without planning, they had turned a night of insult into a lesson of kindness. Days later, people were still talking about the gala. Stories appeared in small magazines and on social media, not about the dresses or the food, but about the moment Richard Gere praised Keanu Reeves. Comments flooded with respect. Fans wrote, "This is why we love him." Keanu is proof that humility is the greatest power. Even people who had never cared much about galas found themselves sharing the story. because it carried something timeless. The guests who had once whispered felt the story heavier than others. They remembered their own words, the way they had laughed, and the way they had been silenced by applause. For some of them, it was the first time they realized how shallow their judgments had been, and though pride kept them from saying it aloud, they knew they had been wrong. The gala was remembered not for the jewels, not for the luxury, but for the truth it revealed, that real greatness does not shout, it does not need glitter to be seen. Real greatness is found in humility, in kindness, in quiet dignity. Richard Gere's voice had delivered the message, but Keanu's silence had made it unforgettable. Years later, when people spoke of Keanu Reeves, they rarely remembered what he wore. They remembered stories like this one, moments when he showed patience in the face of cruelty, when he carried himself with grace. Even when others tried to pull him down, the gala became just another story in the long list of examples that proved who he truly was. A man who never needed to act like a star to shine. For Keanu, the night became just a memory, one of many in a life filled with both pain and kindness. He did not dwell on the insult, nor on the applause that followed. What stayed with him was the reminder that kindness is not something you carry alone. Sometimes it comes through others, like Richard, stepping in at the right moment. Sometimes it comes from strangers clapping, sometimes from fans waiting outside in the cold, but always it comes. The gala ended. The lights of the chandeliers went dark, the tables were cleared, and the hall returned to emptiness. But the lesson of that night did not fade. It lived on in the hearts of those who saw it, a reminder that even in the glittering world of fame, humanity still mattered, and that dignity and kindness will always outshine insult.